Hello, welcome to our Introduction to Personality Theory course, and we continue discussing so-called social and cultural domain in personality psychology. In previous videos, we discussed different social factors and how they influence personality traits and development. And in this video, we will talk about culture and cultural factors, which also play a pivotal role in personality development and contribute to differences between people. So in this video, we will try to discuss what are the relationships between personality psychology and cultural psychology, and different theories of why do cultural differences exist. It's so-called evoked culture series, transmitted culture series, and cultural universal series. And then we will come to a logical conclusion as usual. So personality psychology and cultural psychology have several intersections. So personality psychologists who work in social and cultural domain and study cultural psychology usually pursue four different goals here. So first, they want to discover whether concepts of personality in one culture are also applicable in other cultures, right? So how we understand personality, what are personalities traits, what we consider to be personality characteristics can actually significantly differ from culture to culture, and we need to be aware of those differences and study them. Second, to find out whether cultures differ on average in the level of particular personality traits. So, for example, is there any significant difference in neuroticism between Asian and Latin American countries or not, right? So we can take any taxonomy and any personality trait, conduct cross-cultural study and try to understand, will there any difference between those cultures? If yes, why? If not, why? So it's a lot of research are done to answer those questions. So the third goal here is to discover whether the factor structure of personality traits varies across cultures or it's universal. So basically, if we measure different personality traits and get certain structure in the United States, will it be applicable for Japan? Or if we will get certain factor structure of personality in Russia, will it be applicable for Cameroon, right? So we need to answer this question based on empirical data. And it's important for personality psychologists to understand like how universal it is, or if it's not universal, again, why. And finally, to discover whether certain features of personality are universal or not. It's basically the grand question. So are we speaking about the same personality characteristics everywhere, which are typical for all people, like as a human species, or they're like culturally dependent and they would be different? So it's a big and difficult questions. And of course, we have different theories and researchers who try to tackle all those problems. Sometimes researchers focus on one goal, sometimes on two, some of them try to answer all of them. And we have a lot of data providing us with certain insights regarding each of these big research questions. So we'll try to dive in and discuss all the differences and all the information we know so far. So the first concept we need to cover is so-called cultural variations. So basically, it's a very simple concept. Cultural variations are within group similarities and between group differences, which can be of any sort. Physical, psychological, behavioral, or attitudinal. So you are similar with other people in your group, and your group is different from other groups. It's basically cultural variation. What is important, the concept of cultural variation is purely descriptive, not explanatory. So you cannot use this as an explanation because the fact that this cultural variation even exists requires explanation itself. So when we see that there are certain differences, for example, in communication distance between people in Northern Europe and Middle East, actually the physical distance people use during the communication is very different. So in Northern Europe, like Sweden, for example, people usually stand apart from each other around 1 meter or even 1.5 meters when they communicate, and it's like comfortable distance for communication. In Middle East countries, people during the communication stand very, very close to each other, almost touching each other sometimes, which would be very inconvenient for people from Sweden, and communicating on a long distance. 1 or 1.5 meters would be horribly inconvenient for people from Middle East. So it's cultural variation, but it's not an explanation, it's just purely description. We need to understand why it happens, so that there is such a big and significant difference in distance of physical distance of communication between those two cultures. So again, only descriptive. So cultural variations can be explained through 3 different ways. And we will, in this video, we will try to explore those theoretical perspectives. The first one is so-called Evoked culture series. The second one, transmitted culture series. And the third one, cultural universal series. So they utilize different logic and different reasoning in trying to find explanation why those cultural variations exist in the first hand. So let's start with so-called evoked culture series. So main idea here is evoked culture concept, obviously. So it's defined as cultural differences are created by differing environmental conditions which activated predictable set of responses. So it's not a secret that people are settled all over the world in completely different climate and geographical regions. So we have people who live in far north, like indigenous people of Canada, for example, who survive harsh winters with -40 or even -50 degrees of Celsius winters. And at the same time, we have people who live in a very hot climate, for example, surviving +40 and +50 degrees of Celsius in Central Africa, for example. And they have completely different environment to survive in, different sources of food, different sources of water, different climates and weather challenges, different animals, different plants. And according to evoked culture series explanation, it caused initial differences between people adapting to those environments and starting different cultural traditions. So 2 ingredients are needed to explain this so-called evoked culture. First, some universal underlying mechanism, and second, environmental differences in activation of this underlying mechanism. One example of a universal underlying mechanism is we all need to eat, right, and get some food. So, but how will you get food depends on the environment you're living in. So some areas are better suitable for herding. Some areas are better suitable for farming. Some areas are better suitable for gathering or fishing, right? So this universal mechanism that we need to get food, store it, and save it might be manifesting differently and activated differently in different environmental conditions. And after that, it might cause cultural differences and social practices we have. So, for example, whether someone is cooperative or selfish, usually considered to be exclusively personality characteristic traits, but actually it also different from culture to culture. And research actually shows that it might be dependent on the geographical area you live in, because societies which lived in harsher conditions where there is a huge variety in chance to get food. So like today you have food, tomorrow you can't find anything, show higher degree of so-called egalitarianism. So basically people share more and it's adaptive. For example, today I found some berries and mushrooms and I will share it with my friends because tomorrow maybe I won't find anything and they will share something with me. So such societies actually more prone to share, while societies, agricultural societies, which can rely on their farming as a source of food, actually show less degree of sharing, because why I need to share with someone? I farmed, I worked hard, I harvest my crops. I don't want to share it with anyone. I can eat it myself and I can rely on myself in my farming. So it doesn't mean those people don't share at all, but they're less prone to share compared to people who live in high variance food conditions. So this is an interesting possible source of personality differences on being cooperative and selfish. So here you can see how Evoked culture series explain and try to dig in the past and find this source of differences, including personality differences. So some research shows that early experiences might evoke different mating strategies in people. So here we don't talk about climate or like weather. We talk about like environment, social environment you had during your childhood. So some researchers like J. Belsky argue that children who grow up in harsh, rejecting, and inconsistent environment are more prone to impulsivity and mating strategy marked by early reproduction. So they start to have sex faster than their peers who grew up in different conditions, and they start to have their own children faster. So on the contrast, sensitive, supportive environment for children makes them more conscientious and result in mating strategy based on commitment and later reproduction. So basically, such children prefer just to study, for example, work, and maybe then later in their life start a family with less amount of children, less impulsively making decisions. So Jay Belsky explains this that this environment evokes different personality characteristics like impulsivity and conscientiousness and different mating strategies. So this is interesting because we have some evidence to prove this theory. For example, children of divorced parents, statistically speaking, show more impulsivity and in average start sexual intercourse earlier. Again, it's an average, so if you take 1,000 people, we speak about like these big population differences, which on an individual level, it can be very, very different. So another example of theory which explains personality difference through this evoked culture is an interesting theory proposed by Richard Nisbett. It's American psychologist who initially studied cultural differences between states in the United States, between so-called South and between so-called North. So states which opposed each other during civil war in the United States, which happened in the middle of the 19th century. So he found that this difference still persists even 100 years later, and he coined the term so-called culture of honor. So in cultures of honor, insults viewed as highly offensive public challenges, which must be met with direct confrontation and physical aggression. So if someone insults you, saying something not polite to you, you should hit this person and engage in direct confrontation or maybe a fight to defend your honor. But it can be considered as completely inadequate aggressive behavior in other cultures, right? So Nisbet found the difference on this parameter between northern United States and southern United States, and he decided that the differences lie in the past because many states were using so-called herding economies, so where basically cowboys had huge herds and they just used as to travel from place to place, and it was primary source of food. So in such economy, actually you can lose your stock just because you was insulted by someone and they use physical force and you cannot fight back, and they will just take your herd and you will be just broke. So you need to fight for yourself, and you need to have a reputation of dangerous person no one should mess up with. So, and he supposes that this difference, trying to respond with aggression and even physical aggression on any insult, was evoked by this difference in economics. So in more settled, like agricultural communities, there is no need in cultivation of aggressive reputation. It actually harms you, right? So your neighbors should think that you're like agreeable, cooperative person with whom they can trade and cooperate. And this culture of honor wasn't evoked there. So it's an interesting possible explanation. So we can find different factors explaining the difference between southern and northern states of United America, but this theory falls into umbrella of those so-called evoked culture theories. So evoked culture also can explain certain differences in conformity and authoritarianism between cultures and countries. There is one very creative hypothesis which stems from evolutionary psychology, which suggests that prevalence of disease-causing pathogens causes cultural pressure to conform. So in countries where you actually can get disease very fast, other people don't want to get disease from you, and they force you to follow certain rules to avoid possible infection. So it might be, for example, certain ways of cooking food, certain ways of hygienic procedures, and other social rules. And social pressure would be much higher because everyone's safety and health is on the stake compared to cultures which live in less kind of dangerous conditions in terms of disease, and following those general rules is less mandatory because it doesn't put everyone in your community at risk. So basically, according to this hypothesis, societies which face this higher level risk of getting disease will show higher level of conformity, and this would be even stronger because everyone put pressure on you because it's high stakes situation. So authoritarianism is close to conformity and obedience, So, and some evolutionary psychologists also think it's connected the same way. So, individuals with these traits would better avoid new and unusual situations that might increase disease exposure. So it will cultivate low openness to new experience and high conscientiousness, because you need to follow certain rules, and all new stuff is possibly dangerous and risky, and you should avoid it and stick to the traditions and guidelines and step-by-step guides you have from your society. This is quite an interesting and creative hypothesis, though, in my personal opinion, it's a bit oversimplified to explain such complex differences, and I think it doesn't fit to all examples we possibly have. So transmitted culture theories are based on a completely different idea. So according to this group of theories, transmitted culture consists from some ideas, values, and attitudes which originally were created by certain people. And then they become viral, and everyone starts to follow those ideas. So actually, this has happened with almost all world religions. For example, Christianity or Buddhism or Islam, right? So at a certain period of time, they have like one important prophet who convinced their close apprentices to follow this life path, and then it widespread through like thousands and even millions of people. So transmitted culture tries to find those people, even if we don't know those names, who were the source of certain ideas about social practices and norms and values, and explore it from this perspective. So as you can see, it's completely different from evoked culture theories and utilizes completely different mechanisms. So one of the theories which kind of can be considered based on this idea is theory of Geert Hofstede. So Geert Hofstede is one of the very famous social psychologists. So initially, actually, he wasn't a psychologist. So his trips to Indonesia and England when he was a teenager inspired his future work on researching different cultures. So he served in Dutch army. So he lived in the Netherlands. He served there for 2 years. And initially he had a Master of Science degree in mechanical engineering and started to study psychology only after 10 years of work experience and as mechanical engineer. So, but his career developed very fast. So he worked at IBM International Corporation, where when he founded and managed the personnel research department, where he conducted most of his research projects. So he married when he was 27 and he had 4 sons and 10 grandsons. And there is actually a movie devoted to Geert Hofstede's life, so not all psychologists have this honor. This movie is called An Engineer's Odyssey. So Geert Hofstede started the research, which now is considered one of the primary theories of cultural psychology, though it not fully represented in all the textbooks, though you definitely know some concepts used by this theory, for example, individualism and collectivism. So according to Hofstede, all cultures can be described through certain dimensions or parameters, and that's how we can compare them. So technically, he started his work in 1967 and conducted his first series of research before 1973. So this time was very important for international corporations because it coincided with oil prices boom in Middle East, and a lot of countries of Middle East started to become major economic power in the world. and United States and European companies wanted to collaborate them and strike deals and negotiate new contracts. But they quickly faced a problem that people from Middle East completely different in terms of communication patterns and the way of like perceiving world from like people from United States. And there was a need in research to understand how actually better to facilitate communication, avoid misunderstanding and unintentional like insulting each other, because it was a huge problem and a lot of business contracts actually were like canceled or weren't negotiated because of those communication problems. So Hofstede worked for IBM and actually conducted his initial research. The second series of research was conducted in 1990, from 1990 to 2002, and it coincided with the collapse of Soviet Union and all countries which use socialist model of economy. So they transferred to capitalistic economy. And again, there was a huge need into establishing new business and political contacts with all those countries, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and so on. So, and they were very different. And again, there was a need in research to understand how people make business and how to negotiate with them. So Hofstede's team made a second round of research, also measuring those cultures as well. And initially, Hofstede tried to explain cultures through 4 independent dimensions, but later he added 2 more, so it's 6-dimensional theory that cultures differ based on 6 different parameters. And we can actually compare any 2 cultures based on those 2 parameters and explain the possible differences. So the first parameter is so-called power distance index. Basically, it's extent which is less powerful members of society and organizations accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. So in some countries, power distributed unequally. There are people forming hierarchy, which with someone on the top and someone at the bottom, and people accept this, right? So they say, oh, those high-ranked officials, of course, they should be treated very different from regular people. But in some countries, it's considered to be abnormal, and people think that everyone should be treated equally, and difference in power shouldn't be manifested this openly. So higher degree of this index indicates that there is a clear social hierarchy. In lower power distance index countries, people question authority and ask to distribute power. For example, Russia can be considered a country with high power distance index. People in power dress differently, they wear different clothes and show signs of high social status, and they have money in abundance. They have different types of car, and people use different types of communication when they communicate with their bosses and so on. On the other hand, like such countries as Australia or Austria in Europe show little power distance index, and people actually can't communicate with ministers and parliament members the same way as they communicate with their like close friends, not addressing them specifically. So there is not much difference in communication, how people look like and dress. In Austria, like ministers can ride a bicycle instead of having like a limousine and a lot of guards, showing that they like behave and live the same way as all other people. So individualism and collectivism is a bit better known. So this refers to idea is like, do people identify themselves as a part of the groups and how important this is for them? So individualistic societies, of course, divide people into groups, but your ties to those groups are not that important. So and they're focused like on your individual happiness, prosperity, and your individual goals. So basically, you should choose something which is good for you personally, individually, and other people should do the same. Collectivistic countries, on the other hand, emphasize the importance of being part of the community, and community well-being is more important than individual well-being. So avoiding conflicts in community is more important than your individual happiness, and people try to sacrifice this to prove that they're useful and reliable group members. So Canada, for example, and United States are like highly individualistic countries, while, for example, China or India are famously collectivistic countries. And it's very important which place in community you have. So, and it also affects how people study. So for individualistic cultures, people will choose their university and program just based on their individual preferences. So I like math and I will study math because I like. Okay. For collectivistic countries, opinion of your family might be more important than the personal preferences. So like your parents said you will be a doctor, and you will be a doctor because your family decided it would be the best, and your personal preferences might be not the most important factor. So individualism and collectivism like create very different types of societies, and sometimes highly individualistic people can experience a lot of difficulties in communication with highly collectivistic people. So next dimension is so-called uncertainty avoidance index. Basically refers to people's tolerance to ambiguity and uncertainty. So in some countries, like surprises are considered to be something good. We don't know what will happen, but maybe something good will happen, right? So uncertainty is okay. It might be something bringing something good. In some countries, any ambiguity and uncertainty is defined as negative by default. So if there will be surprise, of course, it would be absolutely negative. So there is a huge difference between, for example, like Canada and United States, where like uncertainty avoidance is very low, so people okay with uncertainty. And for example, Eastern European countries, for example, Ukraine, Russia, Poland, Czech Republic, they will be like avoiding any uncertainty and trying to have more codes of behavior, laws, tacit rules, and try to avoid any uncertainty, any cost, because it definitely brings something negative in view of people. The next dimension is so-called masculinity femininity index. So here masculinity refers to preference of society into achievement, assertiveness, and material prosperity, like having a lot of money and cups and certificates and showing that you're bold and strong and you have a lot of achievements and success oriented. So femininity countries usually value cooperation, modesty, caring about equality. So for example, Northern Europe, Scandinavian countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland associated with femininity, while, for example, actually United States considered to be a masculine country where a lot of people are oriented toward this achievement and higher material status, showing that like you're successful. So in average, femininity societies have actually higher gender equality, while masculine countries actually have lower gender equality. So it results in social practices and affects social equality. Sorry. Next dimension is so-called long-term orientation versus short-term orientation, it's how people plan time. So basically, in how they perceive time. So long-term orientation associates connection of the past with current and future. So lower degree of this index shows short-term orientation. It indicates that traditions are very important. Past is important. And past may be more important than future. So traditions are important. For example, Middle East countries value traditions a lot, and it might be super, super important for them. On the other hand, some countries actually kind of value what will happen in the future, and they show more flexibility and adaptation in their like planning. And Canada would be actually like flexible country on this respect. Sometimes it's called flexible or monumentalist countries with monumentalistic countries like short-term orientation and flexible countries long-term orientation. So all countries are different based on this parameter. And finally, indulgence with contrast restraint index. It's about degree of freedom society gives to people to fulfill their desires. So in some countries, it's considered like, do whatever makes you happy. You want to have a lot of junk food, sure, here you go. You want to have sex with many people, of course, here you go. You want to listen to this music, of course, here you go. Everything which makes you happy is good. In some countries, on the other hand, they value discipline and being similar to each other, and they don't give their citizens that much freedom. So people will comment on what you're eating, on what you're listening, on how many sexual partners you have, how many children you have, and so on. So indulgent societies allow this like freedom and gratification, even if it's like harmful for your health, just like it's important for you to be happy. Canada and United States are actually example of indulgent societies where people just do what they like and have a lot of freedom in getting satisfaction and pleasure in their life. While, for example, China and Russia would be classical example of restrained countries, where people focused on discipline and following strict social norms, which heavily regulate what you can do and what you cannot do. So it's connected with historical past, and almost all countries which had totalitarian or highly authoritarian regimes, political regimes, would be closer to restraint pole, and countries with longer period of democracy would be closer to indulgent part, just because of like history of political systems they had and how they affected their culture. So in general, Hofstede's model is generally accepted as one of the most comprehensive frameworks to study cultural differences. And it's one of the most cited, like he is one of the most cited social psychologists in history. So Hofstede's model have a lot of applications for like business, international politics, international management, and international operation and marketing, because it helps to understand how people negotiate, work, and perceive information. This model was criticized for choosing national level of analysis instead of cultural, because basically some culture is not distributed just in terms of national borders. Several countries, different countries can have very similar and shared culture and language. So in this sense, Hofstede model has this disadvantage. Another critique was attributed to tests and like measurement procedure Hofstede and his colleague had, because most of the participants in their research were working for international companies. And while in, for example, Western Europe and United States, people who work on international companies do not actually strongly different from general population. For other economically developing countries, it may be a huge difference. And people who work for international companies, for example, in like Russia or India, actually getting much higher salary and much higher social position. And in this sense, they hire only privileged people, and thus vulnerable groups of society not represented equally in this research Hofstede conducted. So it's one of the primary criticism of his theory, actually generalizability of his participants. So though he collected hundreds of thousands of responses, it still might be not completely representative because of this initial flaw in the research design. So do cultures have distinctive personality profiles? So one of the biggest research on this intersection between culture and personality psychology, based on 12,000 participants conducted into 51 different countries by Robert McCrae, one of the founder and creators of the Big Five theory, and used his inventory, actually showed an interesting results. So this now personality inventory was translated and adopted in all countries. And after this research, they found that the largest difference lies in extroversion. So North Americans, Canadians, and people from United States and Europeans scored significantly higher on extroversion compared to people from Asia and Africa. So those people are significantly more extroverted. Other personality characteristics such as emotional stability, openness to new experience, conscientiousness, and agreeableness didn't show that strong cultural differences. So why people in North America can be more extroverted is actually understandable, because it's like settler societies founded by immigrants, and again, who will highly likely to immigrate to the different edge of the world, extroverts or introverts? Obviously, it probably would be extroverts, though, because it implies higher levels of activities and sensation seeking compared to introverts. And because it's also genetically connected, so extroversion as other Big Five traits has around 50% heritability. So extroverted people had more extroverted children, and probably that's how like North Americans and some Europeans also became more extroverted compared to Asians and Africans, regions with lower levels of immigration and emigration. But it's important to bear in mind that observed cultural differences are, in average, relatively small. So individual differences are stronger than those cultural differences. So we should be very careful with those results and understanding like what is an average, what is cultural, what is individual. So there are some limitations for cultural psychology here, of course, because of different factors. One of the example is Joseph Heinrich idea about so-called weird societies. So it's acronym which can be translated as Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies. So the thing is, the most of research is conducted in United States of America, Canada, Australia, and several European countries. And participants in those research projects are also from United States, Canada, Australia, and Western Europe. And cultural and socially, they're very different from the rest of the world. And we should be very careful with generalizations because those research are based on a small subset of human population. And actually, 70% of all psychology citations come from United States. So only 30% of articles which are like heavily cited are written outside of the United States only, which actually can create a huge problem. So we don't know what results are actually universal, because sometimes researchers just think that their results universal without much evidence, and they might imply it both explicitly and implicitly. So in future, we will get more results on this, and definitely we should encourage and fund more research outside of the United States to get data about how everything works in all cultures and societies. And finally, the group of theory which try to find cultural universals actually goes in completely different direction. So instead of studying cultural variations and differences, they try to understand what is typical for people from all cultures, right? And it's so-called cultural universals. So some things actually universal for all societies, for example, incest avoidance, facial expressions of basic emotions, as Paul Ekman proved, favoritism of people from your group, favoritism over your relatives, collective identities, division of labor by sex happened in all the countries, revenge, for example, typical for all cultures, and so on. So culture examples, other examples of cultural universals, for example, gender stereotypes were created in all cultures and countries. The expressions of emotions, again, Paul Ekman's theory, and possible universality of the big five factor model, because it was replicated basically in all countries so far. So what are possible conclusions for this video about cultural psychology and personality psychology? So personality psychology has a lot of intersections with cultural psychology. Psychologists try to discover whether concepts of personality in one culture are applicable to other cultures, find how cultures differ from each other, and especially like in terms of personality trait, to discover factor structure of personality. Is it universal or not? There are three groups of theories which try to explain cultural differences in personality: evoked culture theories, transmitted culture theories, and culture universal theories, which offer very different theoretical perspectives on this matter. And finally, in recent decades, more and more researchers recognize that actually the vast majority of research is made in weird societies, and actually we know very little about cultural differences, less than we thought, and we should conduct more research in other countries. So that's all for this lecture. Thank you. In next videos, we will start discussing final adjustment domain.